and welcome. My name is Dr. Carol Alexander, and I am the Head of Professional Relations at Johnson & Johnson Vision. And we are so pleased to have so many members of faculty from across the country, including our friends to the north in Canada and to the south just a little bit in Puerto Rico. It's always nice to have such a large group of folks assembled for a conversation on something that I'm certain is important to all of us, and that's the science of lens selection. We got here today because of a number of conversations with both the faculty and with students in a desire to bring a strong science to the conversation, and frankly for the faculty to be able to have time to yourselves without being in front of the students as we have conversations to allow for open questions that help you get to where you need to be in the education process with your students. So we've listened to you, and that's why we're bringing you this particular information, this webinar today, or tonight, or this evening, depending on where you are. But I first wanted to take a moment to introduce those who will be joining me tonight as speakers. So if we could go to the next slide. As I said, I'll be your host for this conversation, but I'm joined by two very distinguished gentlemen in our profession, Dr. Lyndon Jones and Dr. Kurt Moody. You'll know Dr. Jones as a distinguished university professor at the University of Waterloo, and of course as the director of the Center for Ocular Research and Education. He is joined again with me tonight with Dr. Kurt Moody, who is our Director of Education at Johnson & Johnson Vision. And prior to joining J&J, Kurt worked in an ODMD practice for many years, but then was in the R&D space prior to becoming the Director of Education more recently. And I just want to brag on him just a little teeny bit, because he is someone who has received the Johnson Medal. So a recipient of the Johnson Medal is the highest honor you can get working for J&J in the area of R&D, and he got that for his contributions in the creation of the moist multifocal design. So kudos to him, and I just had to give him that little pat on the back. But gentlemen, I'll let you, since you're on the screen with me here, you might want to both just say a quick hello to everyone.
Hi everyone, thanks very much for joining us this evening.
Yeah, same for me. Thank you very much. Happy to be here.
Thanks, guys. And if we could go to the next slide, we'll take just a minute to discuss what we're going to cover tonight. Along with the conversation on the science of lens selection, Johnson & Johnson Vision is pleased to bring you and your students some physical assets that you'll be able to find as printed materials arriving in your clinics in the next couple of days, but also to be downloadable files for you at access to for any time. But we're going to concentrate on three areas. One is, how does evidence, what's the evidence based in our decision-making process for the selection of lenses for our patients? And particularly notable right now as we're thinking about living through and practicing through a pandemic, how do we think about comfort and hygiene, and what can we tell you and show you and your students about the AccuView portfolio? So Dr. Moody will be sharing that information with you. And in my previous life before J&J, I spent 20 years in the private practice of optometry in Northwest Ohio, so have a fairly good command, I think, of the conversations that we have with patients in terms of what's the best way to have a communication about contact lenses. And so we'll be discussing that briefly towards the end. But we want to spend the bulk of our time talking about the evidence and the comfort and hygiene. But before we get there, a bit of housekeeping. So we'll go to the next slide. And just a reminder for all you people who have been doing Zoom, perhaps even more often than I have, we do want to make sure that we capture your questions and that we have an opportunity to answer them tonight. So if you'll use, down the bottom there, you have the Q&A and the chat. Use the Q&A for your questions, and we'll kind of curate them there and be able to address them as we go through the evening tonight. And then the chat, if you have a comment or you want to share a conversation with others in the group tonight, please use that, but make sure that you click on all panelists and other attendees. That way everyone can share in the conversation as it ensues. So that is our housekeeping, and so we'll get right to it. I wanted to first thank you for your registration and answering a couple of questions for us before that. And so you might say, why did we answer those questions? And largely so that we could talk about where we're at now and hope to get to a place that might even be even better or stronger downstream. And so the first question that you answered was, how confident are you in a student's ability to provide sound rationale for their lens selection in an initial lens fitting to their preceptor? So how well does the student do bringing that information back to you with that sound rationale? 30% of you indicated that you were very confident or extremely confident, but 70% fell into the somewhat confident down to not confident at all. So we do hope that the information we bring you, that you can use in your teaching, and also that the materials that we provide will help your students in that place for sound rationale. And what I'd like to do, since you were so good at answering that question, is just start with a quick poll, because you're that good. It's super easy. True or false? Patients are best served with a silicone hydrogel material. So if you'll take just a few seconds, I'm not going to give you too much time because, well, true or false, that one should be pretty easy for us. All right, Lyndon, because I know you're anxiously awaiting the answer, if we could get to the answers, please. Okay, so tonight's group, a little less divided than we had the last time, 70% saying true and 30 saying false. So I am going to hand it over to you, Lyndon, so you can take us through the evidence and discuss how this poll figures in.
That's great. That's actually a great start there, Carol. Thanks very much for asking that question. Thanks to you, as I say, for joining us this evening. If we can just go to the next slide, please. As Carol introduced me, I am director of CORE, and CORE is very fortunate to work with pretty much all of the companies who work in the dry eye and contact lens space. And my sincere thanks to Johnson & Johnson Vision for hosting this webinar this evening, and actually hosting this entire topic. So this entire topic around the evidence around the choices that we make as clinicians, and more importantly as educators, the information that we can pass on to our students such that they can make appropriate decisions, it is really important. Okay, next slide, please. So what sort of contact lens fitting choices do practitioners make around the world at the moment? There is an enormous variety of lens materials and frequency of replacement for practitioners to make. And so what choices do they make currently? Well, probably the best way of being able to look at that is actually some data that gets published each January in Contact Lens Spectrum. And each January, there's data published from a global consortium of researchers that basically survey in their countries the options that practitioners are making across a wide number of patients. And so you can look that up every January in Spectrum. And what I've done is I've taken that data to provide you with some interesting data about what's being done at the moment. So if we can go to the next slide. What I've done here is I've divided up those choices that practitioners are making into two materials, so silicone hydrogel and hydrogel, and then within that, I've subdivided that into whether they are choosing reusable lenses or daily disposable. So I've given you three markets in the three left-hand brackets that you may be interested in. But on the right-hand side, what we see there is the average of all of the data collected. And this was a pretty large sample. So 25 countries, over 20,000 fits. So it's pretty representative, I think, of what's going on around the world. Now, if we look at that right-hand bracket, what we can see first of all is that silicone hydrogels are more widely used than hydrogels. But given that silicone hydrogels have been out now just over 20 years, they were released in 1999, we can see that hydrogels still account for around about 25% of lenses being fit. So not far off actually what it was that the surveyed people out there actually said. You came up with a split of 70-30, that globally it looks like it's about 75-25. So certainly hydrogels still have a part to play. Next, look at that subdivision within, oh no, let's go back, thanks. Next, look with that subdivision within silicone hydrogels and hydrogels. Within the SiHys, what we see is that the majority of SiHys that are chosen are reusable, and that's flipped within the hydrogels. So within the hydrogels, the majority that's being chosen are daily disposables. So we see a wide variety of materials and frequency of replacements being fit around the globe. Now, if we can go to the next slide. What I would really be interested in to know, and I'm sure you would be as well, is how are those decisions being reached? What evidence are the prescribing practitioners using to make those choices? How do they decide whether a patient would be best served by using a hydrogel or a SiHy? How do they know whether the patient would be best served by using a daily disposable or a 2-week or 4-week frequent replacement lens? And that was really what set this whole project up. Conversation with Dr. Kurt Moody, who you'll be hearing from after me, and 3 of us from CORE, so myself, Jill Woods and Karen Walsh, published a paper looking at what evidence there is out there to help us make those decisions. And that was actually the pre-reading material that you were provided that I'm sure you all read fully, but if you didn't, it's okay. That's what we're going to go through now. So after this presentation, you can actually look through that paper, and I think it is actually quite a useful teaching tool to think about when we're educating our students. So that's basically what this presentation of mine is going to be about. What evidence do we have to make the decision between A, material, and B, frequency of replacement? Okay, next slide. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to divide up that evidence into 2 broad groups. I'm going to start with the history and symptoms taking. What evidence do we have there? What questions can we ask that actually help our prescribing decisions? Is there any? And secondly, let's look at the clinical tests that we do. We have all been educators. We've all educated students and been educated ourselves that when we have a naive contact lens wearer, so a new contact lens wearer, these are the tests that you need to do. Well, when we do those tests, what evidence is there that the information we glean from those tests will actually help us choose the appropriate material or the appropriate frequency of replacement? So let's start with the history and symptoms. So next slide. All right, so in terms of the evidence that's out there that should help drive the questions that we ask, we've basically got 5 broad categories which I've listed for you here. First of all, let's look at some sort of general health and medications. What we do know is that corneal infiltrative events, or CIEs, as I'm going to refer to them for the rest of the presentation, is higher with some chronic conditions, things like rheumatoid arthritis, and also smoking. And we have good evidence that in those situations where CIEs are higher, we can reduce that CIE rate by going for daily disposable. So in any situation where we either see CIEs or the questions that we elicit relate to a higher likely CIE event, we should be thinking daily disposables. And we do have good evidence for that. What about things like seasonal allergy? Now, again, seasonal allergy may not be one of those questions that we would typically ask a new contact lens wearer, but actually it's one of the few responses where we have good evidence around what lens type to fit, because we have 2 very well-conducted studies that quite categorically showed that in those patients with seasonal allergy, that they are more comfortable by using a daily disposable lens. Now, both of those studies actually used hydrogel daily disposable. So that is actually the only evidence that we have. It's not to say that there is counter evidence that a silicone hydrogel daily disposable wouldn't work, but we don't have that evidence. Whereas we do have evidence that hydrogel daily disposables work. What about the general ocular history? When again, it comes back to this CIE risk. We know that the CIE risk is higher if there's a history of ocular surface disease or if the patient presents with CIEs when we first see them for a contact lens fitting. So again, if I see that, the first thing that's going through my mind is, okay, I'm going to choose a daily disposable modality for that patient. What about things like hygiene responses or occupation? Well, again, we do have evidence around why we should be asking these questions. We know that CIEs are associated with substantial bioburden on lenses. So patients who are not good at cleaning, looking after the lenses, maybe replacing the lenses on time, if they have previously worn lenses, are likely to have an increased CIE risk. Also, that CIE risk increases with work which exposes the patient to dust, wind, fumes, or water. So again, in those situations, I'm going to be looking immediately at considering a daily disposable modality. Now, what about baseline symptoms? What about asking the patient about whether their eyes feel dry or whether they have any sort of symptoms generally with their eyes prior to contact lens wear. Now, again, I think maybe many of us wouldn't necessarily think about asking that question. But if we can go to the next slide, when we think about how we do that, how do we glean information from a patient? We know from the dry eye literature that there are a couple of different ways that we can do that. So we could use a validated dry eye questionnaire, and much of the information that's been published is actually on the OSDI, the Ocular Surface Disease Index. You can actually download that from the web in a paper format, or it is actually available as an app as well. You can download an app and put it on a tablet or a phone. You can either get the patient to fill it in before they come in, or you can get one of your support staff to do that prior to the patient coming in for a contact lens fit. Another thing that you could think about doing is just simply asking the patient, hey, how do your eyes feel? You know, tell me if you've got any symptoms with your eyes. Do your eyes feel dry, irritated, uncomfortable? Now, if we were to ask that, is there any evidence out there that would help us choose one material over another, so SiHy or hydrogel, or one particular choice of frequency of replacement? Well, if we can click now, please. Actually, sadly, there isn't. We have no published peer-reviewed evidence that asking those questions will help us make the decision between either materials or modality. But the one thing that we do have from a number of studies, which makes it worthwhile asking those questions, relates to potential long-term success and whether the patient may well have symptoms when they go into lenses. Because if they have a higher OSDI score, or if they report increased number of symptoms, they are more likely to be a patient who is not necessarily, able to wear their lenses 16 hours a day, 7 days a week. So the nice thing about that is it kind of sets up the conversation for a patient to say, hey, given the symptoms that you have, maybe we're not going to be getting 7 days a week, 18 hours a day, but we certainly should be able to get, maybe half of that length of time, maybe 4 or 5 days a week. So it helps that conversation with the patient to set the expectations before they start lens wear. So that's why it is worthwhile asking. Next slide. A couple of the other things worth asking about, because it will certainly help our choice of material, relates to oxygen delivery. So for example, if a patient has a high prescription, they're a hyperope, they're a high myope. If they're wearing a thick lens design, a multifocal, a toric, if they're going to wear their lenses on an extended wear modality, or sleep in the lenses overnight for whatever reason, that increased oxygen that's required, again, immediately starts us thinking, okay, we're not going to go down the hydrogel route, we're going to likely choose a silicone hydrogel route. So oxygen delivery certainly is one of those things that helps us drive material choice. And if we go to the next slide, in terms of modality, so in terms of frequency of replacement, again, a couple of obvious things to source from the patient relates to their occupation, their expectation around when they're going to wear the lens, and things like, how often are you going to wear your lens? So, for example, if someone's going to wear their lens just for high days and holidays, going out for dinner, or sport only, then that may likely lead us to use a daily disposable. If they are a first responder or an emergency services worker of some description, and they need to be up and at them straight away, and that could potentially lead us down that continuous wear route or extended wear route, in which case we're going to be looking for a lens that provides that level of oxygen, and they're likely going to be in the lens full time as well. So those things are kind of obvious in terms of choosing the frequency of replacement. Okay, so that's kind of looked at the symptoms and history section. Now let's move on to the clinical things that we look at. So moving on, please. Okay, during the clinical exam, which parts of the clinical exam that we do actually helps us with the prescribing either modality or material? Okay, so let's take a look at those. Moving on to, let's click, good. So we're going to start looking at tear film quality and tear film quantity. When it comes to tear film quality, of course, most of the time we're going to use fluorescein breakup time. We've done that forever and a day. Is there good evidence that fluorescein breakup time provides us with good information around material or frequency of replacement? Well, let's take a look. Click. Actually, no, there isn't. There actually is very little evidence that measuring fluorescein breakup time helps with our prescribing choices. But again, a good reason to do it is that we do have good evidence around the fact that if a patient has a short breakup time, they're more likely to be a dropout. So again, it helps us set up that discussion around potential for that patient being symptomatic. Okay, now that's fluorescein breakup time. We know from the dry eye literature that that's not necessarily the best way of assessing breakup time. What about a non-invasive breakup time? Let's go to the next slide, because when we look at non-invasive breakup times, again, lots of publications out there. Do we have any good evidence that maybe assessing breakup time using a non-invasive method would be more helpful? So let's take a look. Is there any good literature? Click. Sadly, once again, no, not helpful in terms of material or frequency of replacement, but 3 really good studies that show, again, if you have a longer non-invasive breakup time, you're more likely to be successful than if you have a shorter breakup time. So again, well worth doing, not to help our prescribing decision, but helpful in terms of how likely are they to be successful. So next, now that's tear film quality. What about tear film quantity? If we can go to the next slide, please. So tear volume, typically we tend to assess usually using one of these 3 methods, either Schirmer, phenol red thread, or the least invasive of all being tear meniscus height. Now I'm not a great lover of Schirmer, so let's concentrate on the 2 less invasive methods, phenol red thread and tear meniscus height. Any good information out there, any good data out there that would help us decide on material or modality? Well, again, if we can click. Sadly not. No real evidence that help us with prescribing decisions, but again, good evidence that no matter which of those, phenol red thread or tear meniscus height, if we have more tear film volume, then they're more likely to be tolerant, successful wearers as opposed to having low volume. So worth doing, but doesn't help our prescribing decisions. Okay, so that's tear film. What next? What else would we assess during the assessment? Let's go to the next slide. Well, the thing that we always tell our students to do, of course, is a full slit lamp exam using fluorescein, making sure particularly that we look for corneal staining. Now, surely there has to be some evidence out there around corneal staining or conjunctival staining that would help our prescribing decisions. Well, actually, click. Bit of a delay. No, sadly not. There actually is only a very weak link between contact lens discomfort and corneal staining. We still need to do it because it gives us an idea of how healthy that cornea is. But again, if we're looking at evidence around prescribing decisions, simply not there. That doesn't help us decide whether a patient is should be in SiHy or hydrogels, or with respect to frequency of replacement, which I think might surprise some of you, but sadly, that data isn't there. Okay, what else would we measure? What else would we do after that? Well, I think typically what we would do next, if we go to the next slide, is we'd look at the lids. So we expect our students and we as practitioners would be looking to flip the lids. Now, when we flip the lids, we'll be looking at 2 things. We'll be looking at the level of redness and the level of lumpiness or bumpiness and how smooth it is. We're making sure that we grade it, so make sure that we have a repeatable grading system. And again, there actually is good evidence out there that if we have eyes that look like this, then that's more likely to be associated with allergy. And as I mentioned earlier on, that's where I'm thinking a daily disposable lens. What else would we look for on the lids? Well, we'll probably look, if we can go next, for these 2 things. We'd be looking for signs of blepharitis and also for meibomian gland dysfunction. Now again, well worth looking for these because we do have good evidence that in these situations we're going to have extra gram-positives on the lids. That's going to kick out gram-positive exotoxins into the tear film. Those are going to get sucked up by the lens, held against the cornea, and initiate CIEs again. So whenever I see these 2 conditions, bleph or MGD, first thing I'm going to do is treat them. You need to get these cleared up before they get fit. And then, because of those extra gram-positives that are still going to be kicking around, I'm going to be looking to put these patients into a daily disposable lens. Now, when we think about meibomian gland dysfunction, if we can go to the next slide, we have a lot of ways these days of being able to assess that. We can assess the meibomian glands both using expressibility, so we can do that either manually, or if we want to do it more scientifically and more repeatably, using a meibomian gland evaluator that you can obtain from Johnson & Johnson Vision. Or, of course, you can also visualize the meibomian glands using more sophisticated imaging methods using infrared meibography. And again, if we were to do that, can that help us look for advice on things like frequency replacement or material choice? Now, again, historically, I don't know if we would have a long time ago really thought very clearly about whether we would be doing this on a new neophyte contact lens wearer. Well, actually, if we go to the next slide, this actually is one of the few clinical techniques that actually provide useful information. It doesn't help us decide whether a patient should be in a particular material. That information is not there yet. It will be soon, I think, but it does help us again with frequency of replacement, because again, if you've got a patient who's got active meibomian gland dysfunction of any type, you've done the best to clear it up, but there's still some hanging around, go for a daily disposable. Good evidence that that will actually be most successful. What else can we look at on the lids? Well, let's go to the next slide. Another thing, again, that I think it's kind of a new thing for us to look for, but it's really well worth looking at, is lid wiper epitheliopathy. This is where we would put fluorescein or lissamine green into the tear film. We'd be looking to basically flip the lid over, and we're looking for that portion of the lid that actually moves across either the cornea in a non-lens wearer or across the surface of the front surface of a contact lens if you're a contact lens wearer. And it's that area that moves across it, that so-called lid wiper region that wipes across the lid. And we really want that interaction between the undersurface of the lid and the front surface of the cornea or the front surface of the lens to be as lubricious and as smooth and wettable as humanly possible. So again, does lid wiper epitheliopathy or LWE help us in our decision? Well, again, if we click, not really, because there is a fair number of studies that actually have shown LWE is associated with contact lens related dryness or not, but well worth doing, because we do know that the mechanism that produces that appearance is related to friction. Now, what you ideally want is a lens material that has the lowest coefficient of friction possible, because if you do that, then you'll get the most lubricious interaction between the lens and the lid. And so actually, when you look at the mechanical properties of contact lenses, actually friction, a low coefficient of friction, is actually pretty much the only function that's been shown to be related to comfort. So well worth doing. Finally, one other thing to look at is, if we go to the next slide, is something that I think, again, you wouldn't necessarily be looking for in a contact lens fit, and that's this appearance. Now, again, you might be thinking, well, it's blepharitis. He's talked about that before. It's actually not blepharitis. If you look at those collarettes, they're actually these collarettes are still attached to the lid. So this is actually, if we go to the next click, it's actually this wee beastie. This is the mite Demodex, and if we go to the next click, again, we have good evidence around the fact that lots of people have these Demodex, more so older people than younger people, but it's a pretty high prevalence. You can actually see it quite easily just by doing as I've done there in the bottom video. You can rotate that around using your forceps. Because the Demodex is head down, that irritates them. They kind of back up out of the hair follicle. And so you can find their presence there. And the reason that I'm bringing this to your attention is actually, if we go to the next slide, because of two really important papers that I don't think we necessarily have focused on, but they are very important papers. The first of all, the one on the left, that actually showed that in a large sample of contact lens wearers, the contact lens wearers were more likely to have Demodex mites than the non-lens wearers. And then the image on the right-hand side, which is a paper from a very unusual journal, not typically seen by optometry, but really important for us. And in this very important paper, the researchers actually took a large bunch of contact lens dropouts and asymptomatic wearers. In the asymptomatic wearers, only 6% of those asymptomatic wearers had the presence of Demodex, whereas in the dropouts, quite the reverse. 93% of those dropouts showed an overpopulation of Demodex. So again, bear in mind, look for Demodex, very important in new lens wearers and also in symptomatic wearers. So we go to the next slide. Basically, in summary, next slide, please. When we're looking at the evidence around helping us make the decision around material versus modality, not a huge amount of information out there, but some. Ask the patient the questions around their occupation, previous complications, look at tear film quality and quantity, and certainly look at the lids. The lids are one of the most important things that help us decide whether a patient is going to be a successful lens wearer or not, and what frequency of replacement they should be in. And with that, Carol, I'm going to hand actually back over to you because that's all I got. Thanks a lot.
Great, thank you. We do have a couple of questions, so why don't we just go straight to that?
Sure.
And one that's an interesting question that comes up, and again, it's thinking about materials, hydrogel versus a SiHy. What are your thoughts about the amount of oxygen that gets through to the cornea? So you're wearing the lens, the oxygen that gets through, and the impact of change over time to the cornea dependent on material.
Change over time, that's a very good question, because I mean, we now have, as I say, we've got 20 years worth of information around SiHys. SiHys came out in 1999, and so we've been able to track patients for 20 years now wearing both of those lens materials. And inevitably, you do see, because of that normal variation in any sort of physiological factor that you look at, there will be some patients for whom they will show some changes due to a chronic lack of oxygen. We very rarely actually ever see these days things like neovascularization. Kind of really doesn't hardly happen at all. But you can see that sort of early sign of change that shows a chronic lack of hypoxia through limbal hyperemia. And so there will be some patients who do have, who are able to show increased limbal hyperemia at the limbus, more so in thicker lenses than in thinner lenses. And in those patients, you would certainly go to a SiHy. But what's interesting is the numbers of people who actually wear hydrogels, who, having worn them for 25, 30 years, actually have very pristine corneas. So, I think there's a thought that any new person these days being fit with lenses has to be fit with a SiHy, because that's really what every patient needs, and that's simply not the case. There are patients for whom, and we don't understand why, but they just aren't able to wear silicone hydrogels and actually do very well in hydrogels. I love silicone hydrogels, but I don't want people to think that, oh, if I fit them in a hydrogel, I'm doing this patient a disservice. That simply isn't the case. The evidence isn't there at all.
Thank you for that. And one of the things you talked about, and we all know, is how important the tear film is for our contact lens wearers. But as we think about that, just in the general population, what are your thoughts about doing meibomian gland evaluation on all patients?
No question. I'm shocked. So I work 1 day a week in clinic. I used to be a real person. I was in private practice for 12 years before I did this crazy job. But the majority of my time is actually spent doing research. Through our research studies, but also my time in the clinic, I now really appreciate how important it is to evaluate meibomian glands in all patients, contact lens wearers, as well as non-contact lens wearers. And again, typically in sort of, when I'm looking for a dry-eyed patient, I would historically think, if I'm going to look for meibomian gland dysfunction, I'm only going to look for it typically in a symptomatic older person. That's simply not the case. We find meibomian gland dysfunction in patients before they get fit with contact lenses. We see it in younger people. There is now good evidence that even in things like teenagers, with the increase in digital device use that they're using, and because of that reduced amount of blinking that they do, the evacuation of those glands, the meibomian glands, are not happening at the rate that it should do. And we're seeing a lot of teenagers now with fairly marked meibomian gland dysfunction that we never would have seen 20 years ago. So I would say now, as part of your routine eye examination, regardless of the age or type of patient, take a quick look at those meibomian glands.
No, and that's a really great seg to a question that we had here about lid cleaners. And so the question is, what is your thought on the use of hypochlor solutions and or other types of lid cleansers for individuals who wear contact lenses regularly?
I think it's a great idea. I really do. I'm not endorsing any particular one product. I think just keeping those lids clean and making sure that the patient has good functional meibomian glands is critical. You know, there are there's lots of information out there that supports the use of pretty much all of those lid cleansers that are out there. But I think actually, you know, just like brushing your teeth and flossing your teeth is part of your normal oral hygiene, I think we should be looking at all of our contact lens wearers at having good lid hygiene as well. And a really nice piece of work actually out of Australia, so out of Sydney, Mark Wilcox's PhD student, Siddha Reddy, produced 2 really good papers that showed that if you clean those lids up, you can take a patient who thinks they're asymptomatic because they don't know any different, and actually make them far happier with their contact lenses. So clean those lids up, you'll have a lot happier contact lens wearers for sure.
Thank you for that. And I think at this point we do need to move on. So if we could go to the next slide, I want to hand the presentation over to Dr. Moody. Kurt, if you can go ahead and just kind of dig right in here to contributors of comfort.
Great, thank you, Carol. And hey, Lyndon, great job. I hope to kind of key off a lot of the things that you had just talked about. So if we could just go to the next slide, please. So now that we're sitting here, you know, in this pandemic, you know, living in COVID, you know, we hear so much in regards to general hygiene, and that's terrific. I mean, it's great that we finally have patients washing their hands and being more cognizant about hygiene. But we also know that one of the things that's come up has been the question in regard to, you know, what about contact lenses and the hygiene with contacts? So I'd like to just take a few minutes to talk about that. And when I think about contact lens hygiene, I think about it in regards to having really 2 different arms to this. So I'm showing this arm on the left, and that's the contact lens safety profile of the lenses themselves. And Lyndon did a great job of summarizing some of that. I mean, we know daily disposables, without a doubt, are the safest way to wear a contact lens, followed by daily wear reusables, and then extended wear contact lenses. So that's really well grained in the literature. We know this all very, very well. But there is another aspect of this. And before we get to that, I do have a poll question I'd just like to bring up before we go to that aspect. So what I'd like you to think about is, when you think about contact lens behavior in regards to the patients, do you think patients most incorrectly perform? So which of these do you think patients incorrectly perform that can elevate the risk of infection? Hand washing, topping off solutions, cleaning their case, or sleeping in their lenses. So just pick one of those 4. And let's see the results of the poll, please. So pretty good. It's, you know, what bubbles to the top? Hand washing, which makes absolute sense, and cleaning the case. And yeah, wow, it's pretty good. They're neck to neck there. And I think the other half of this slide will actually address some of that. So if we just click onto the next slide, perfect. So, you know, if all we were doing was fitting robots, all we would be concerned with what we have on the left. But we're fitting patients. So we have to think about the behavior of our patients. And that's exactly what we have here on the right side. So these patient modifiable factors that I've got listed here on the right, this was work that was done by Professor Philip Morgan out of the United Kingdom at the University of Manchester back in 2011. But I think these are still just as relevant today as it was back in 2011. He identified these 8 factors that are highly correlated to the hygiene or the safety of contact lenses. And it makes sense, right? Topping off solution, which we called out, overnight wear, rubbing and rinsing, case cleaning. So actually the answer to the last question was case cleaning. What Professor Morgan found was only 3% of patients clean their cases properly. So I mean, it's kind of shocking, isn't it? But 97% are doing it incorrect, which we know is highly correlated with creating that bioburden on the contact lens case, which of course can cause infections. But hand washing, you know, as I mentioned, it's really bubbled to the top because of the pandemic. And I think the good thing from all of this is hopefully our patients will all be much more hygienic as we come out of this. But why hand washing? Simply because we have now the ability to self-inoculate the contact lens. So if, you know, as you're handling things, you end up picking up a pathogen, whether it's a bacteria, a virus, you know, a protozoan, you now have the ability that if your hands aren't clean, and you can now introduce that into the ocular environment. So if we click to the next, please. And this really kind of talks about these compensatory behaviors. Oh, actually, if we go back one, it talks about these compensatory behaviors. Things such as rubbing your eye, touching or moving the lens, things that can introduce those bacteria, those pathogens into the eye. So now if we go to the next slide, so how often do you think that might actually happen? Well, we went out and we actually surveyed 1,554 current contact lens wearers. We asked them, what do you do or what have you observed when you have an uncomfortable contact lens? And what we found was that 89% of those patients told us they either rub their eye, they use eye drops, or they manually move or adjust the contact lens. So now we have created a vector where you could introduce that pathogen into the eye. So absolutely, what we know now is compromised comfort may mean compromised hygiene. So we've now shown a relationship of overall contact lens performance, something we're all really cognizant of safety, and something that we just always thought, you know, when you think about comfort, I think most people thought maybe it relates to dropout, but now we're actually seeing it could be relating to almost really a health endpoint. So let's go to the next slide, because what I'd like to introduce to you is talking about what we are calling contributors of comfort. So we've identified what we're saying are 4 pillars or 4 parameters of a contact lens. So these really are material properties, material parameters that correlate to comfort, which we're now saying, of course, correlates to hygiene. So Lyndon did an absolutely great job talking about those clinical findings, but now I'm going to talk a little bit about the contact lens parameters. So, don't know why that came up. So we've got coefficient of friction, which is how lubricious the material is. Lyndon talked a little bit about that. Took away some of my thunder there, Lyndon. We'll talk about that later. Edge design, the wettability, and the modulus of the lenses. Now, I'm really not going to talk at all in regards to edge design or modulus, because I think you all really know a lot about that. We know modulus, you really need to be in that sweet spot. If it's too low, could affect handling. If it's too high, we know it can definitely have an effect on the ocular tissues, the conjunctiva, both bulbar and tarsal. Edge design, some great work was done by an independent investigator in London who now works for Alcon. And that work actually showed that the invisible edge has the highest correlation to comfort out of any of the edge designs. So, you know, what she was looking at was an infinity edge versus a round edge versus a blunt, and very, very strong data showing that that invisible edge is really the most ideal. Lyndon talked a little bit about it in regards to that lid wiper epitheliopathy. But let me just go a little bit deeper in regards to coefficient of friction and wettability. So if we go to the next slide, please. You know, coefficient of friction came out of this, the science of coefficient of friction, which is known as microtribology, came out of the orthopedics world. And as you could imagine, as they started working on artificial joints, it became very, very important that they had a method to measure just how lubricious those joints were. And that was microtribology. And we found that we have the same need for this type of science in contact lenses. we work with the foremost research center in the world on this, a group called SUSOS out of Switzerland. And I just want to describe to you what the methodology is, and that's what I'm showing there in the middle. The methodology is trying to mimic what's happening with the eye. So we take the contact lens and we place it on a pedestal, and then we bring this tip down. Now the tip has a glass circular tip on the bottom, and that tip is coated with mucin. The amount of force that the tip exerts on the contact lens is the amount of force that we know the lid exerts on a contact lens. So as you could see, this would represent what's happening with the eyelid. This entire apparatus then is dropped into a vat of tear-like fluid. Now, tear-like fluid meaning there's mucins, there's aqueous, and there's lipids in it. So we're simulating what's happening with the tear film. Then the tip moves back and forth, and after 100 cycles, the amount of force is measured, and that's the coefficient of friction. As Lyndon mentioned earlier, the lower, the more lubricious, so the lower, the better. So what type of data is there on this? So if we go to the next slide, please, I'd like to show the coefficient of friction data of the Johnson & Johnson lenses. So let me just ground you on what we have. So along the y-axis is the coefficient of friction. On the x-axis, you see I've got 4 different time points. And what are those time points? The 0 hours is the coefficient of friction right out of the blister pack. Then the other time points, the way they were created was they took 10 lenses of each type. And you could see the types that we have here. We've got AccuView Oasis 1 day in the green, and in the blue we have 1 day AccuView Moist. And the way the experiment was, we took 10 of those contact lenses, put them down into that vat, and we would put the lenses in the vat for 20 seconds, and then we would bring them out for 20 seconds, in the vat for 20 seconds, and out of the vat for 20 seconds. So doing that cycling for 6 hours. After 6 hours, measure the coefficient of friction, start doing the same cycling again, measure at 14 hours, same cycling, and then measure at 18 hours. So you can see what we're doing is we're simulating a wear cycle over the course of a day, and that's really what we have there with the coefficient of friction and the data. Now, the little line I've got going across horizontally, and it's marked as 0.015, is the coefficient of friction of the natural cornea. So I think that's very relevant because as you're designing lenses, you'd love to be able to have a lens at or below the coefficient of friction of the natural cornea. So if you look at it, the 1 day AccuView Oasis data is at or below that line throughout the entire wear cycle. And the 1 day AccuView Moist is just a tad bit above it. I also want to just call your attention to the error bars, because the error bars will tell you how much variability there is from lens to lens. And again, that variability is minimal. So I think this is great data because again, it calls out the importance, especially of looking at comfort towards the end of the day. So if we go to the next slide, what data do we have in regards to that there really is this correlation in regards to coefficient of friction and comfort? So this was work that was done by Dr. Noel Brennan when he was an independent investigator in Melbourne, Australia. And he was compiling this data for some time. So he brought it all together, published this in Optometry and Vision Science a few years back. On the y-axis is comfort, and he measured that on a 0 to 100 scale, with 100 being the most comfortable. On the x is the coefficient of friction. And you could see the high correlation as evidenced by that R-square value. So again, that R-square value being 0.8 and above is a very strong correlation. Let me tell you 2 of those little dots though. That dot that's sitting there at 93 happens to be Oasis, and that dot that happens to be at 88 is Moist. So again, the strongest correlation we're seeing is in regards to coefficient of friction and comfort. He looked at the same correlation with DK over T, and it was 0.03, telling us no correlation. Well, let's go on to wettability. So if we go to the next slide. And when we talk about wettability, we're really most concerned about wettability to the components of the tear film. But if we go to the next slide, in the lab, the way we measure wettability is we use a test called sessile drop, where we drop a drop of saline onto the material, and we measure the angle that's formed between that droplet and the material the lower the angle, the more wettable. So if we go to the next slide, like I said, we're really most concerned about the wettability in the tear film with the tear film components. And what we use to enhance that wettability is our PVP. So our PVP is known as K90 PVP. K90 is the molecular length of the PVP. We've patented that. We know that that is the most tear-like. And what's unique about that PVP, if you just click once, please, is the fact that on the molecule, as I'm showing here on the left, it has both hydrophilic and lipophilic entities on it. So that means those entities are going to be very, very attractive to hydrophilic and lipophilic aspects of your tear film. When you have a molecule like that, it's known as amphiphilic. So this is really critical for performance because it's telling us that that molecule will be equally attractive to the tear-like, to what exactly we have in our tears. PVP is also a demulcent, meaning it's got mucoprotective properties, and it's a humectant, meaning it attracts water and holds it, but it does that without pulling from the surrounding tissues. So what data do we have in regards to the fact that, you know, this really is clinically relevant? So if we just click to the next slide, please. So this is some work that was done in Japan by a researcher. Her name is Dr. Ko. And what she did was she took a patient, 26-year-old female, that was known to be a contact lens dry eye patient. And she fit that patient with two lenses. In one eye, 1-day AccuView Moist, and the other regular 1-day AccuView. Now, the reason for that is both lenses, geometry-wise, are exactly the same. They were both minus 0.5 diopters, but the Moist lens has PVP, the standard one doesn't. She then took the patient and put the patient in front of her aberrometer and measured those higher order aberrations every second during that interblink period. And you can see as early as 4 seconds, we start to see breakdown in the tear film, as evidenced by seeing some of those higher order aberrations, which continues to get worse and worse all the way up to 8 and 9 seconds. So I think there's great clinical evidence of the benefit that we've got with that internal wetting agent. So if we go to our next slide, please. So what are we trying to do? What's our design mantra here at Johnson & Johnson? It really is to mimic that natural ocular condition. The closer I could get to that natural ocular condition, the more invisible the lens is going to be on the eye. And specifically, what we're trying to do is reduce that on-eye friction. As Lyndon called out, you know, the fact that lid wipers going over the lens 12 to 14,000 times per day means we want to drop that on-eye friction to really get that no lens feeling. So hopefully you're going to find this data interesting. And I mean, really our intent is to give you information you could pass on to the students so that they could actually pass that on to the patients to explain why and what their rationale is for fitting a lens. So Carol, I think we may have time for a question or two, if we've got them.
I have a couple for you. So there was one question that was, there are no error bars on the coefficient of friction and comfort graph. So is that a linear relationship?
It is a linear relationship. And the interesting thing is, since that original data was published, Dr. Brennan has actually populated it with even more data. And what he found was that the R-square value, I think, went up to about 0.88. So even a stronger correlation with more data.
And then a follow-up question is, how do other lenses compare to J&J lenses on coefficient of friction?
On the coefficient of friction, you know, and this is, I think, really clinically the important piece. And we've tabulated a lot of this data. The out of the blister pack measurement sometimes is very, very close. The greatest difference occurs throughout the course of that wearing cycle. And we've published some of that in regards to 1-day Oasis, where, and just to throw out just some numbers, we looked at the relationship between 1-day Oasis at 18 hours compared to Dailies Total 1. Dailies Total 1 was 8 times higher, and the new Precision one was 11 times higher than our 1-day Oasis. And I think that's important because, you know, so often as a clinician, we ask the patient how comfortable the lenses are right out of the blister pack. But really what we need to think about is what's the comfort at the end of the day, because truly that's when the patient's going to make that decision if it's a good lens or not.
Yeah, I think that's something that we all know, right? When we take them right off in the diagnostic in the chair, they feel pretty good. But what happens 18 hours down the line?
Yes. Yep.
So that's really an important piece of things. And looks like I've got one more question. And this may be because I introduced you as a Johnson Medal recipient. So I'm going to throw a moist multifocal question at you. And the question is moist multifocal thicker than the non-multifocal or sphere?
That's a great question, because when we were designing that lens was one of the things I was very, very cognizant of, and actually it's not. So like our regular 1-day moist, the vast majority of those lenses is coming in right around 85 microns, and we kept the overall thickness of moist multifocal the same as what we had with moist. And also, Core did a great study for us where they took a group of current silicone hydrogel lens wearers wearing multifocals. They refit them into moist multifocal, followed them from pretty sure, Lyndon, I think it was 30 days.
Yep.
And after 30 days, compared really all of the physiological endpoints that you could measure. Corneal thickness, staining, limbal injection, and really could not find any statistical difference between the two. Minor differences, but nothing statistically or clinically significant. And I know Core has helped us, and we've gone ahead and have actually published that work.
Thanks, and I'm going to get us right back onto the subject at hand today. Let me throw one last question at you. How do you instruct your patients on cleaning their case?
Okay, yeah, and there's a great article, and we may be able to pull it up and put it on the chat. And it was published in Optometry and Vision Science on the right way to do it. And very similar to, what we know in regards to COVID, the best way to do it is use soap and water. So taking that case after you've dumped out the solution, cleaning it with standard soap and water, and then drying it actually with a tissue. So just like when we're cleaning contact lenses, we know it's that digital aspect that's really important. So dry it with a tissue, air dry it upside down on a clean tissue. And not too surprising, the best place to store that cleaned case is not in the bathroom. Put it in your bedroom, put it someplace else, but the bathroom is probably not the best place to put it.
All right, we're going to move along now into some of the assets that we've built for the faculty and the students. And one of those things is the AccuView decision tree. But I want to share with the audience, because again, this was a question that you answered for us. How would you describe your confidence level of students in their first contact lens rotation to be able to explain the differences between the various AccuView brand of lenses? And 74% of you said somewhat confident to not at all confident. And I think I hear that echoed when I have individual conversations with students, is they are a little bit intimidated by the whole thing, even within our brand portfolio. So Kurt, I'm going to ask you maybe to take them through what we built for them to make that a little bit easier.
Yeah, absolutely. That's great. And just like Carol, just like you've mentioned, I mean, we've been asked this time and time again, do we have some type of guidance or suggestion of which of our lenses in our portfolio might be best for a particular patient? So if we go to the next slide, so we've created this decision guide, which, we're getting into your hands, and I'm going to take you through it as far as front to back. So on the front, we got a great quote from Lyndon that really just talks about the fact that, you've gone to school for 4 years, learning optometry, you've spent some time maybe in residency, and just the critical factor of the doctor's role. So I think it's just an absolutely great quote, and Lyndon, thank you for providing it, because it really, I think, calls out the importance of the role of the doctor. If we go to the next slide, on the next page, what we have got here is some of the attributes that we feel are important in regards to contact lens parameters, which I've addressed a good number of them already. But if we flipped to the next page, we'll actually get into the meat and potatoes of what we've got with the decision tree. So on the first page, it goes through that decision tree in regards to daily disposables. And let's face it, I think all of us have the same basic tenet, and that's that if there was no restrictions in regards to cost and no restrictions to parameters, would we fit anybody in a reusable? Probably not. So the first question is the RX available as a daily disposable? If the answer is yes, then you go to the next box. Are any of the following present? Seasonal allergies, irritation prone, or CIE risk factors? If the answer is yes, think about 18-year-old male that maybe smokes, right? You go down, and if the answer is yes, we're saying consider putting them in One-Day AccuView Moist. The fact that that lens absorbs a tremendous amount of lysozyme is really the rationale behind that selection. If the answer is no, then we're saying that you should go ahead and consider our One-Day AccuView Oasis. Now, if we go to the next page, it actually takes us over into the page in regards to reusables. So again, the first decision box there are any of the following present? A less robust tear film, contact lens use in challenging environments. If the answer is no, meaning they've got this great robust tear film, they're not in those challenging environments, then we feel that they're probably a pretty good patient, if you feel appropriate to put them into a monthly lens, Arvida lens. If the answer is yes, now your next decision is that patient bothered by light? If the answer is yes, we think our AccuView with transitions is a great option. If the answer is no, and then we're saying 2-week Oasis. So hopefully this really simple kind of yes, no decision tree will help kind of guide the students in regards to the J&J portfolio on what could be the best rationale. So hopefully you'll see some good use for this. And we think it's a great way to go forward. But once, the students and the doctors have made that decision, the next critical part is communication. And Carol, I'm going to toss that over to you to talk a little bit about.
Thanks, and we'll go to the next slide, and even after this. And I'm going to move through this pretty quickly because I know we are at the top of the hour. But what we've created for you here is just a one-pager, not meant to be used in your clinics because we recognized it's got the AccuView brands here. But what it was designed for was to be a really great way for your students to role play with one another. And if you look at this, it's divided into lifestyle, ocular factors, what is the prescription, and what would be the recommendation and rationale. So you check the boxes to inform your decision on the communication. The one thing that I find time and again, I was probably guilty of it in my practice, and I know as I talk to doctors across the country, we fall into a habit oftentimes of saying, I don't want to feel like a salesperson. And then at the same time, what do? We tell patients price and modality. So it's difficult when we're right there in that moment. You all know that, but how can we make it easier? And so this piece was designed to allow you to allow them to practice with each other and have the right kind of conversations. And because we know our products better than anyone else, we were able to populate this with the recommendation that was connected to the AccuView brand. But you can see any other daily disposable or reusable could be used or highlighted in your conversations. But that's what this piece was designed for. If we can go to the next slide, please. These are the three pieces that you'll be getting. Again, they're designed for your students. On the left, it's an 8.5 by 11. It's two sides actually, but it highlights the evidence-based information that Lyndon and his team put together at CORE. And I think Dr. Moody also helped work on that. In the center is just the front and back side of what is a trifold pocket guide that has the decision tree. We'll also give you the decision tree in an 8.5 by 11. And then finally, the personalized recommendation form for your use in teaching the conversation around contact lenses. So those are the pieces that are coming actually in a box in the next 2 days. And I think they're all addressed to your contact lens chiefs. So they'll arrive in your clinics here very shortly. They are also available for you for download. And if we go to the next slide, please. These are the folks that you know. These are our managers that call on our accounts both in the United States, Canada, and Puerto Rico. So on the left side of the screen, Rika Lovas, she manages our schools and colleges of optometry to the west. Josh Meredith, our schools and colleges of optometry to the east. Kane takes care of our colleges, our two colleges in Canada, and Javier in Puerto Rico. These people are great resources for you. You can always find me and you can always find Kurt as well, but the day-to-day activities and the things that you need to get done with your students are oftentimes best connections are with these 4 people, and they just really represent us well and have your best interest at heart. They'll be able to tell you everything you need to know about the resources that we've created for you. And I think I don't know that we have any time left for any additional questions. If there were any that we missed tonight, we'll make sure that we find out who the person was that asked the question, and we'll get back to you with an answer. But on behalf of everyone at Johnson & Johnson Vision and for all of you at the schools, we just want to say thank you for your time tonight. Thank you for joining us. And we're here for you as we all navigate through this pandemic, and hopefully look back on it one day with stories to tell rather than having it define us in our special year of 2020. So thank you again.